Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this 1 hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 793, February the 16th, 1986. Phil Donahue had a program this morning with William Colby and Reed Irvine of Accuracy in Media and Chris Christopherson discussing the movie America. Christopherson was speaking from the Soviet Union. I have a lot to say about that. I'm not watching the movie. I hope you're not watching the movie. I hope you never watch ABC again. But all I want to say is that at this point is that William Colby comes on as somewhat of a liberal or leftist, and because he doesn't want to escalate the arms race with the Soviet Union, but he's not introduced as the man who headed the Phoenix program, whose name was directly linked to the Nguyen Bank, the bank that took the narcotics out of Laos and Southeast Asia, or his close linkage to General Singh Laub, General Richard Secord, CIA Theodore Shackley, CIA Thomas Cline, or CIA Edwin Wilson, and their role with the Phoenix program with torture, or the fact that 4 of these men, Wilson's in jail, are defendants at the current time in the Christie Institute lawsuit as being narcotics traffickers today, continuation of Colby's operation in Southeast Asia, or their assassination of journalists in Costa Rica, the attempted coup in Costa Rica where they killed the U.S. Head of the embassy and blamed the Nicaraguans for it. Colby comes on as the leftist on Phil Donahue's show, just as Tom Braden does on CNN. I'm Tom Braden from the left, who headed his own CIA operations, covert actions, and death squads that allowed the narcotics traffics to flow. The program of America shouldn't be discussed the first week. It probably should be done when it's over. As I say, I hope you have the guts not to watch it. It's ironic that this movie, America, that's so controversial, is the last testament of William Colby. From the OSS and a Knight of Malta, he developed himself into a position of owning Capital Cities, not Metro Media, and Capital Cities bought ABC Network. He formed Capital Cities with Lowell Thomas, who was in the CIA. They were both agents always. And Mr. Casey ran and managed Ronald Reagan's campaign when it got a little iffy whether he could pull it or not, and they pulled every dirty trick they could. And, of course, as CIA director, he bought this station, ABC. So America is his gift to you and to escalate the Cold War. Now, there are many corporations involved with this CIA, ABC, William Casey operation. And I suggest, if you have any guts, that you just say, I have other networks. They're all bad. CBS is bad, and NBC, and CNN. But you don't have to watch this particular one, and if you make a promise to yourself you'll never see it again, no matter what's on it, you won't lose anything. Believe me, you won't lose anything. There was an article about America and the corporate reasons for making it this time. Ronald Reagan wants to leave the legacy of Star Wars to the world, and he wants the contracts in the hands of certain people. They'll be so large that we can't back down, or we'll say the money was wasted. And there are 2 things that run this country. One is weapons and one is drugs. I'll speak briefly about the weapons and the movie America, and then continue a part on drugs that I started last week, drugs and Contragate. There are persons on the board of ABC who would make a lot by scaring you and making you fear that the Russians will take us, and therefore we have to have the Star Wars to protect us from anything they want to do to get their foot inside the door. It isn't a war movie, but it's to make you hate the Russians, and if you hate the Russians, you'll get more weapons. Here are some of the people on the board of Capital Cities ABC. Robert P. Bauman is on the board. He's chairman and executive director of Textron, a member of the board of directors of Avco Financial Services, which is a subsidiary of Textron. Textron's based in Providence, Rhode Island. It's one of the top corporate military strategic defense initiative contractors. Incidentally, this rundown in the military was published in the People's Daily World, February the 12th, 1987. And I'm not afraid to cite organizations and publications, left or right, when their material is documented and based upon facts that you can look up in Dun & Bradstreet if you want to spend the time. To continue, this company, Robert Bauman's company, Textron and Avco, was awarded a total of $120 million in Star Wars contracts between 1983 and 86, according to a study by the Council on Economic Priorities. The contracts of Avco and Textron, which it acquired in 1985, Avco produces, among other things, aircraft engines, structures, defense systems, defense space systems and products. Avco produces Operation ICBM systems, experimental ICBM, reentry systems, ICBM penetration aids, ABM target vehicles, aircraft penetration aids, space systems, tactical weapons, anti-armor, munitions, rocket, nozzle materials, ICBM nose-tip materials, thermostructural materials. In 1985, Textron was awarded $1.9 billion for Pentagon business, including Star Wars. They produce aerospace, electronic products, helicopters, air cushion vehicles, rocket engines, electromagnetic defense systems. On the board of Capital Cities ABC is William I. Spencer. Also on the board of directors of United Technologies, which was the president of that firm, of course, was Alexander Haig. Before he became president, Secretary of State, rather, he wants to be president, a slip of tongue. And Haig, well, he sat at the desk of United Technologies, was meeting Francesco Pazienza and Michael Ledeen, warriors of the supersesma. There's little silent secret teams that plan overthrows of governments to make them safe for the hands of the narcotics dealers. United Technologies is 7th in the list of 1985 recipients of military contracts. They got $3.9 billion. They produce marine engines, rocket motors, airborne systems, automotive and space equipment, military helicopters, energy conductors, military electronic systems, semiconductor memory devices, integrated circuits, and electronic subsystems. M. Cabell Woodward, Jr., on the board of Capital Cities ABC, vice chairman, chief financial officer and director of ITT, the major corporation that funded Adolf Hitler from World War I to World War II and built planes for Hitler during the war. And with Mr. Benz and his operation, they were very influential in having Salvador Allende murdered and put in the dictator Augusto Pinochet in Chile. That was a monument to ITT. They are major communications and telecommunications corporation. In 1985, ITT took $1.5 billion in Pentagon contracts. Mr. Frank T. Carey is on the board of Capital Cities ABC, and on the board of directors of IBM and Morgan Guaranty Trust. If you read George Seldy's books, written right after World War II, brilliant books, he lists the millions and millions of dollars that Morgan Guaranty Trust gave to Adolf Hitler and Mussolini for their fascism. The 1985 Pentagon spending figure for IBM was $1.8 billion. They produced data processing machines, systems, telecommunication systems, and products. Morgan Guaranty Trust is the primary bank for Martin Marietta, another of the top 20 military Star Wars contractors. They took in $73 million in SDI contracts from 1983 to 86. The company got $2.7 billion from the Pentagon. Martin Marietta makes aerospace, defense, electronic products, communications, information systems, aluminum, aggregate, construction material. Alan Greenspan, a member of the board of Capital Cities ABC, sits on the board of Alcoa, a major producer of aluminum, one of the major materials used in spacecraft, aircraft, and military vehicles. The idea of making America was set in 1983, shortly before Capital Cities acquired ABC, but then it was developed again in 1985, and of course William Casey and the CIA and Ronald Reagan and Star Wars and Edward Teller were operative from the time Reagan got into office, but Reagan had been pushing the Star Wars with Edward Teller earlier than that when he was governor in California. They were preparing for this. Also on the board of ABC is Norman T. Pace. He's director of Sperry Corporation that took in $1.6 billion in military contracts. Sperry produces information processing system, defense, aerospace, electronic systems. Frank Carey and Alan Greenspan were on the ABC board before Capital Cities took over. Then William Casey, the CIA director, bought the station. Now his brain is fried, literally zapped, and he leaves us with America. There was an article in the New York Times today titled Reagan's Secret Foreign Policy Apparatus. And this has to do with Project Democracy. It was first called Project Democracy, then it was called National Endowment for the Arts, and he introduced this team that was supposed to be above board for democracy and arts, giving it these misnomers, for National Endowment for Democracy, rather, and Project Democracy, not the arts. June the 8th, 1982, in a speech before the British Parliament, to show how great we are and all this money for democracy, he was telling the British about that. I'll do more on this article next week, but the point I want to make about it that is very important is, number one, it is a misnomer. There is no real secret policy. You may not know all the operations, but it is a misnomer. This is an open, above-board policy. But what is secret? What is the necessity for secret that Oliver North and Ronald Reagan and Fritz Kramer and the national security agencies need? What is the secret? The secret, the bottom line, is narcotics traffic, weapons and narcotics. Anti-communism covers the Mossad, Israel, Nazis, gun runners, assassination teams. There is no morality. The economy is based upon, years ago we thought it was based upon war. It is based upon weapons and war. That is what the secret government is for, because if Congress knew, and of course Congress could know, they won't take tapes of Mae Brussell and they won't listen because they already know this is happening and I'm not supposed to be telling you it's happening, and they look the other way. There's no secret policies. There's no secret teams. There's a new book that just came out called The Underground Empire. It's by James Mills. He wrote for Life magazine, Wall Street Journal, hardly a leftist. And in the introduction on the cover of the book, he says people on the earth spend more money on illegal drugs than food, more on drugs than housing, clothing, education, medical care, or any other product or service. The international, it crosses all boundaries, of narcotics industry is the largest growth industry in the world. Its annual revenues exceed $500 billion, 3 times the value of all United States currency in circulation, 3 times more than the gross national products. In fact, in his book, I think he says there's $3 million of narcotics that are sold daily. And he says that this international narcotics industry is an underground empire. It's sovereign. It is an empire, and it has a solid front out in the world, working and exploiting and acquiring, similar to 19th century imperial kingdoms, far-reaching as the British Empire, and as cohesive as the states of the American Republic. Now, Oliver North is an agent of that underground empire. He stayed there until he was forced to leave in November under Fritz Kramer sitting on the National Security Council for the past 6 years, identified by Robert Novak. Fritz Kramer was in charge of the entire Southeast Asian War. He was the mentor, and still is, behind Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. And I've said before, wherever Kissinger and Haig make ground or break bread, the drug traffic flows. It opens up for the empire, these veins into the empire. Southeast Asian War wasn't used to make democracies anywhere. We didn't care about countries. We didn't care about people. The purpose of that war, and he was the plans officer of that. Kramer was over General Westmoreland in making policies. It opened up narcotics traffic, offshore bankings. It built networks of heroin and cocaine and opium, and took over for the French and the British left off, transferred a lot of the overt activity at the time of the OSS becoming the CIA, and in the 50s, the CIA took over those areas to begin our narcotics traffic. People like General John Singlaub, General Richard Secord, CIA Thomas Cline, CIA Theodore Shackley, CIA Edwin Wilson, all active, and I cite their names, and I will do it over and over again because you have 2 generals and 2 top officials of the Central Intelligence Agency, defendants today in a trial of drug traffic, assassinations, death traps, and that is the underground apparatus. It is a secret foreign policy. It had to stay secret because it is drug traffic. That is what the NSC is about, and that is where our armies go. There's 2 things one to make weapons and the other narcotics traffic. So I'll be doing more on this next week. There's a very good book that describes some of the linkage of this. Penny Lanou's book, The Banks We Trust. As a matter of fact, for subscribers to World Watchers last year, I was offering that, thanks to Tom Davis at Research, is one of the premiums, and it's a book everyone should have. And this goes into banks such as the Nugan Bank, which links our government to Laos, Southeast Asia, and the opium cocaine, the very people involved with Contragate. There's a chapter on Chase Manhattan, and of course Chase with Kissinger on the board has been a big funnel and a source of operation with Middle East, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan drugs. The Florida bankers, the mobsters, the offshore havens. She has a chapter. Those are the linkage of President Nixon, Bibi Rabosa, George Smathers, Nixon as vice president, and his contacts to them. And then the Miami, Columbia cocaine connections that are currently in the news, linked to the Contragate. And the World Finance Corporation, which is a right-wing terrorist in the Arabs, which is part of the Colombian group, and the Vatican connections to Steve Baum, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the Sicilian Mafia, very important linkage of the banks and the drugs. So that's what the secret team is about. That's why it is necessary. Now, last week I went at great length to talk about drug connections as much as I could in 1 hour. Because of the arrest of Carlos Leder Rivas, the cocaine king from Colombia, who was brought in last week in his close association with affinity for the beliefs of Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. He stands between statues of them when he speaks. He has a linkage to Robert Vesco, which opens up other veins and arteries that are very important. Leder was brought in last week, and I particularly emphasized the linkage in the news just last week to George Bush and cocaine contracts, and I'm going over that again in a few minutes and update the linkage of events that took place this past week. And I also cited 35 major articles. I didn't have room for more. I could double it, of the connection of cocaine and drug traffic to Contragate. So it's very much in the news, and it's very, very important. Now, before I get to the drug traffic, but it's not separated, and this involves drug traffic also, November the 10th, 1986, I did a 1-hour broadcast on the various pockets of the Contragate because it would be so big and vast, and at various times we'd have to hit sometimes the Iranian story, sometimes the Nicaraguan story. All of these people that I'm citing lead back to the assassination of John Kennedy. They go earlier to the Bay of Pigs, and then the coup in '63. So the Iran story, the Contragate, are not separate from that. And also I cited other problems that will come out. Eventually the summit at Reykjavik, which was in the news today, that isn't going to go down. What happened at the summit, that story is yet to be told. And the Challenger I cited as an open sore and open pus. And of course there's the neutron bomb in Cameroon that has not yet been described properly. But the hub of all of these operations, one of the men, you can't say there's a single one, but identifiable as a hub of the drug traffic, the assassinations, and the coups, and the Nazi fascism, is John Singlaub. He's the common denominator between the Mossad, between the Nazis, between the drug traffic, between the assassinations, and between the domestic operations that are going to happen in this country. The misnomer that this is a foreign team in the New York Times today is totally wrong. These people work domestically, treat us like third world. We are being reduced and pulverized like countries in the third world are treated by us now, by this team. Singlaub I cited as a hub of a will because of his connections to the World Anti-Communist League, to Nazi terrorists, to Chiang Kai-shek's operation in Taiwan, to the Kuomintang, and to Reverend Moon. Singlaub's work with the Knights of Malta, the Vatican, his connections to Soldier of Fortune, Robert Brown. He set up that magazine with a Vietnam veteran for recruiting what are called private armies that are very visible as part and approval of the United States. His links to Western goals with their computers into the police departments. And on the board there is Edward Teller and Admiral Moore, Teller of Star Wars again, the importance of Star Wars, and also his friend Spitz Chanell, who's under investigation now, became president of Western Goals when Larry McDonald was dumped in the ocean on the Korean airline. And Singlaub is important in the American Security Council, which is the twin sister of the National Security Council, but remains separate and has close linkage to the Center of Strategic and International Studies that gives all policies to the White House. And Singlab, of course, is the man pushing the neutron bomb that would make the growth process possible. The foliage in the buildings for narcotics traffic just get rid of the people. So Singlab is a kingpin, and in lieu of that, I just want to mention him for about 2 minutes because Singlab was on the news this Sunday evening last night. ABC News said that Singlab has now moved to the Philippines. He's going to help Corazon Aquino or work on his own to get rid of communists. Now, get rid of communists, of course, means to get rid. There's two definitions of getting rid of communists. One is to make the world free for drug traffic, and the other is to turn the world Christian. Those are his goals, and he works with organizations that have that express purpose, even though they work with the Mossad. The overview is to make the world Christian, and I'm sure the Mossad that work with him probably would be glad to go along with that operation. They have that kind of mentality. Now, Singlab is a defendant in the suit, along with these other characters, the Christic Institute of Drug Traffic, assassination coups, and in Nicaragua, planned one. Of course, he's been in many more, and the murder of 7 journalists, the attempted murder of Eden Pastora, and the 2 persons that filed the suit. But Singlab has now moved to the Philippines. Liberty Lobby had an article, a very interesting article, January 26, 1987, about treasure hunters in the Philippines involving John Singlab, the Vatican, and Reverend Moon. I have about 30 articles on the gold treasure in the Philippines I've been meaning to do, but this is the most interesting of all of them that I've read, written by Tom Valentine. It's called Treasure Hunters on the Move. It's gold rush time in the Philippines, and it's about gold fever, that portions of treasure trove buried by the Japanese during World War II are buried in the Philippines, and samples of the gold can be obtained from the Philippine National Bank. In going for the gold treasures in the Philippines, the gold that is received is handled by the Vatican Bank, according to this person, and that makes sense because Cardinal Sin was instrumental in getting Mr. Ferdinand Marcos and his wife out of the Philippines, and he's very closely associated, although the Pope sometimes slaps his hand, but the Pope doesn't do very much of that because he'd like the hand to have the Vatican gold. So this will be handled, the payments and the telecommunication between the Vatican Bank will be getting the delivery and payments of the Philippine gold. Now, William Casey and William Rogers were attorneys for the Marcos family. William Casey of the CIA. He's a Knight of Malta of the Vatican. And it's easy to see now why Senator Lugar and Senator Paul Laxalt were forcing Mr. Marcos out, because Corazon Aquino's husband worked with Singlab, Shackley, Secord, and Cline's. He worked with the Southeast Asia Phoenix program of William Colby, and she can be very much at home with his team, and she's allowed Thomas Cline's and John Singlab to the Philippines, and Singlab is there now, evidently working with her. There's a man named Bob Curtis who says there are approximately 172 different Japanese treasure troves, and they're looking for this gold. He's recovered more than 2,200 tons of Japanese gold in 1975. He's afraid to go back. He has authentic maps of locations, but if he goes, he'll be killed on the spot. Permits to invest in treasure hunting come from President Corazon Aquino. There are 4 groups that are going for the gold. One is at Calatagan Bay. This involves Al Myers, an American engineer with a Philippine consortium headed by Francisco Sumalong, a Philippine congressman, and the uncle to President Aquino. And they hope to be getting up about 800 tons of gold within the next few weeks. Another group is called the Nippon Star. They've kind of been pushed aside. It was originally run by Cesar Loran, a Filipino who worked for General Fabian Ver, but they fled to Hawaii with the Marcos, so they can't be so active. The third group is the Phoenix Overseas Project, headed by John Singlab, who has established an office in Manila, and Singlab of Western Goals with Mr. Chanell was a large raiser of funds for domestic operations as well as international operations. Imagine what he'd do with the gold if he could give Mr. Chanell's offices and so forth computers into every police department in the United States around the world. So Singlab is over there digging this gold. He was a fundraiser for Mr. Chanell, and worked with him along with Ollie North, getting money to get Ronald Reagan reelected and hopefully congressman they wanted. Singlab's involved the National Security Council, the CIA, the Iran scandal, the arms in the Contra arms, the drug he's defended in the Christic Institute. Now he's on the Phoenix program that he's been setting up for a couple of years down in the Philippines. The New York Times, August the 14th, reported that Singlab was working with the Anti-Defamation League with Erwin Swall, S-U-A-L-L. Of course, the ADL is the Mossad, and Executive Intelligence Review has been running articles for years of the linkage of drug traffic, the Mossad, Israel, the Zionists, with fascist organizations. Erwin Swall is helping Singlab clean out the anti-Semites, or the overt anti-Semites, in the World Anti-Communist League, so the organization can keep going. But the definition of anti-Semites is very thin, considering that the Israeli Mossad would work with Klaus Barbie and staunch Nazis, protect these people, or protect Joseph Mengele and be the chief of security for Mr. Strassner in Paraguay. John Singlab, according to this article, is using his influence to get permission from the Philippine government for searching on this land. His partner there is Korean holy man Sun Myung Moon, who's also involved. They want to finance what they call their private army with Philippine gold. What they say is the private army will be used by Singlab and Moon to finance international armed forces determined to buck communism. Does that sound like the Freikorps of Adolf Hitler? How can General John Singlab have a private army when he works with the overt fascists and wants, as I say, to deploy the neutron bomb, was a general in the Army and touches every base of the privately funded, direct Defense Department-linked organizations in narcotics traffic, gun running, assassinations? Remember in the Philippines, Karl Wiedenbach, graduate from Hitler's Kriegs Academy, whose real name, he changed his name, born Karl Wiedenbach to Charles Willoughby, was chief of security in the Philippines with Douglas MacArthur. He worked with the Japanese war criminals. They may just know where this money is. And, of course, Willoughby works closely with Singlab and that gang. Ryosha Sasakawa, the Japanese war criminal who formed Moon's church, is behind Reverend Moon. Here is Moon digging up gold for the Fourth Reich, what they call a private army, is a world control, and they all say they want Christian organizations to get this money, and it'll go to the Vatican. It can hardly be a private army. This is that empire, no longer underground. This is the empire. The goal of the Fourth Reich was to put away the Nazi gold. Form corporations used forged money and counterfeit money, and also money, flight capital, taken out of other countries to escalate the Reich. Involved with these people is Francois Junot, the Swiss banker. He attended meetings in 1944 where Martin Bormann was, and Hitler's top henchman on how to build the Fourth Reich, set up corporations, and use the Swiss bank accounts, flight capital, and set up organizations throughout the world, both of terrorism and the police force to counter the terrorism that will control the masses when the fascism come. Junot is the one who hired Jacques Verge as the attorney for Klaus Barbie, and he also hired the attorney for Mr. Abdullah, the terrorist who is now on trial in Paris for shooting an American general. Part of the Nazi gold network has always been Prince Bernhard. There's not coincidentally, an Operation Bernhard. Bernhard heads the Bilderberger organization that has meetings annually with Kissinger and Haig and all the powerful multinational corporations. So they're looking for Nazi gold. I'm just citing people that have been working with this gold for a long time. Bernhard was in the Gestapo. He was on the board of IG Farben and used Swiss bank accounts, and he is still not in the background right now, but a very powerful man. Also linked to this Nazi gold is Hermann Apps, who was on the board of IG Farben, who's the head of the Reich Bank, who wrote the pay checks for Adolf Hitler. Hermann Apps is currently with the Pope, who worked at Auschwitz for IG Farben, and their projects have involved Nazi gold. And so that the dream of Singlab and Moon goes directly to Willoughby and Sasakawa and Junot and Bernhard and Hermann Apps and the Vatican. So this article you may take a little bit seriously, and it is frightening. They want to buck communism and have international armed forces. through these powers that be. And Jack Anderson, according to these articles, visited the Philippines a while ago with John Singlaub there. Anderson, knowing he's a defendant in this suit filed by Mr. Sheehan on behalf of plaintiffs attacking Singlaub and his team for gun running assassinations. These are the people in whose hands the Nazi gold will be. Jack Anderson is allegedly working with them. There is the Nippon group with Fabian Baer that's eased out, the Phoenix group with Singlaub, Moon, and the Vatican connections with all of them. The Delta group, another group, is working from Tulsa, Oklahoma for this gold, and there's a Myers group working in San Francisco and in the Philippines with Francisco Sumilong, Aquino's uncle. I say San Francisco because Corazon Aquino has very powerful relatives there and also in Pebble Beach, and they're working under the National Christian Businessmen's Association. So this is the only time I have on this half of the broadcast to do the Singlaub Moon Philippine gold connections, but it could be horrendous in consequences going into the Vatican Bank. I'll take a 1-minute break now and go on to the narcotic connections of the Contras and some very important articles this week. It affect all of us someday and what they're doing now, working down there to dig up this gold. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of World Watchers, program number 793. And I want to go into the articles on drug connections to the Contragates for the second half of this program and probably for many weeks to come. The Washington Post had a story September 15th, 1984. That was 2.5 years ago. It was regarding George Shultz, the Secretary of State, speaking before the Miami Chamber of Commerce, and he was telling them that the Reagan administration was making progress towards halting the flow of illicit drugs into the United States, and that the role of the drugs came from communist countries who were involved in drug trafficking. He said this was a cause of great concern for the free world, nations of the free world, and he's speaking in Miami, the headquarters of a lot of the banks of narcotics traffic, and certainly the hub of the anti-Castro Cuban drug connections to Southeast Asia, to South America, and going all over the world. Schultz said that Cuba was involved with drug smuggling, and he cited a person who had been arrested, Federico Vaughn, who said that drugs were coming out of Nicaragua. Later, Federico Vaughn was completely discredited. A witness who was to testify against him, Adler Barry Seal, who was the pilot for Jorge Osha, I mentioned him last week, one of the kingpins of the Colombian cocaine cartel. Seal was gunned down February the 20th, 1986, but even though he was gunned down, the evidence came out to illustrate that there was no support for the statements that George Shultz was saying to the Miami Chamber of Commerce. This is an administration that went into office saying that the president would be hard on terrorism, and we find that he not only was arming Iran, but giving the nod to Israel to go ahead and arm until we sent the arms directly to them ourselves. This is the administration that was going to be hard on drugs, that is directly linked from the National Security Council, from the generals, the admirals, and the agents of our military involved with drug traffickers and retired generals, retired CIA, still working in the White House, Pentagon, and State Department, right up with the Vice President of the United States, and some of them, I'm sure, the influence, of course, would go right to the White House, but working directly with George Bush, CIA director, who at that time worked with these drug dealers. There was a very important article in the Washington Post, February the 3rd, 1987, titled Organized Crime Ties Found Here, here meaning Washington, D.C. Pizza parlors linked to Columbia drug ring. Now, the pizza parlors that they're talking about in Washington and in Virginia are linked through 7 months of FBI wiretaps to the pizza parlors in New York City, to the Sicilian Mafia from New York City to Sicily, and the pizza parlors are the connection of Chief of Staff Donald Reagan and Merrill Lynch and his banking contacts, the Credit Suisse in Switzerland and other international institutions. This is the first linkage that I've seen in an article, and it's referring to a court case that is taking place in Washington at the current time that links to the Southern Air Transport, the CIA airplane, and the Colombia cocaine king, Jorge Osha, who's a partner of Mr. Leder Rivas, who was arrested one day later. This explains why he was allowed to be picked up after doing years of narcotics traffic with Robert Vesco and the international figures. But this court case opened up in Washington, February the 2nd. It was reported in the Washington Post, February the 3rd. And I'll go into the chronology of drug arrests and murders since that date. Last week I gave you a chronology of drug dealing events that pertain directly to Vice President George Bush. But what preceded them was the article one day before that was in the Washington Post that I just read this week about the cocaine distribution. The article was written by Nancy Lewis and Carl Murphy, covering a court case in Washington that is going to be one more piercing of the Contragate story as the two merge together, and will take you probably then, and as the stories evolve through the next few years, not necessarily in the court cases, but the public is still not totally aware of the Donald Reagan pizza connections enough to be outraged and demand that he never should have been Secretary of the Treasury, much less Chief of Staff of the White House. The article says a cocaine distribution network operated out of pizza restaurants in Washington, Virginia. They've been linked to organized crime in one of the world's largest drug cartels. That's the Medellin cartel, the Colombia group, with Jorge Osha, and his partners, of course, are Pablo Escobar. Both of them are defendants in the lawsuit of the Christic Institute, have named those two, and Mr. Leder Rivas was arrested one day after this came out. This is only the second time, they said, that authorities have linked drug trafficking in Washington, D.C. to a major Colombian drug exporting cartel. The reason it's only the second time is that J. Edgar Hoover was part and parcel of the drug operation of the organized crime operation. J. Edgar Hoover's sole goal, and he was appointed FBI director by Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, was to go after communists and labor leaders. Anyone who was a drug trafficker or a fascist was okay for him, and Hoover worked with Interpol and the top Nazis in charge of the Jewish solution. So drug traffic and Nazis were okay for J. Edgar Hoover, and that's why the powers that be never even allowed anything like this to happen. The alleged network, they said, is the most extensive ever uncovered in the Washington area, and it stretches from Washington to Columbia and Virginia. The cocaine sold along with the pizzas, and then it goes even further. FBI agent James Glass directed the investigation 8 months ago. This is just shortly before Eugene Hasenfus fell down in Nicaragua, and that he testified February the 2nd, 1987. That's one day before this was printed. In the U.S. District Court in Washington, that Alfredo the Butcher Torriella, 43, he was charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine. He's an associate of New York's Genovese organized crime family. Now, the Genovese connections go to Jack Ruby in the Dallas operation that was involved in the murder of John Kennedy, to Raymond Donovan and the Schiavone Construction Company, and the Reagan administration crime families have associations closely linked to the Genovese, the very operations that made it possible for Reagan and Nixon to become in the White House after the two Kennedys were murdered. Those people were instrumental in playing a role in killing John Robert Kennedy, the Genovese family, and the links of the organized crime group. But the arrests in Washington are linked to the Genovese organized crime family. Torriella is nicknamed Jack the Butcher, because of his work in New York City collecting debts for organized crime extortionists. Torriella operates a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. Beniamino Centurino, 48, owner of another pizza parlor in Washington, is a good soldier of the Sicilian Mafia. This is separate from the American La Cosa Nostra, but it's organized in the same way. So if you want to draw a square in terms of the Contragate drug connections that are coming now, you have the Washington, Virginia at one corner, your New York pizza parlor at the other, Sicily, Italy, and there's extensive lawsuit going on there now, as well as one in New York that just was winding down, and then Colombia, the Colombia cocaine kings. And of course, the common denominator between Washington, Virginia, and New York pizza is Donald Reagan, Chief of Staff of the White House. The article says Beniamino Centurino, owner of the eatery, as I said, is a good soldier of the Sicilian Mafia. Giuseppe Luciano Cortono, associated with several pizza restaurants, Pizza Delight in particular, also has Sicilian Mafia connections. Remember when Alfred Bloomingdale gave a pizza parlor interest to Vicky Morgan, his mistress, down in Fort Lauderdale. Centruni and Catoni allegedly sold more than 24 pounds of cocaine to an FBI undercover agent, which is very little. Actually, the sales were from June 1986 to January 87, and the arrest just took place in January. The FBI obtained court-ordered wiretaps of Catone and Centurino's homes, and after they listened to them, they got 4 more wiretaps going, and the pizza restaurants the people operating the restaurants were arrested, altogether 12 people with the drug importers. The case was broken down into 3 areas. The importers, the ones coming from the cocaine in Colombia, to the middlemen that purchased the cocaine and put it in various places in Washington, Virginia safe houses, and 3, the retailers and the pizza parlors that deliver the cocaine with the pizzas. Court documents allege that the importers, the importer part of it, were part of the Medellin drug cartel headed by Jorge Luis Ocha Vasquez out of Colombia. Again, he's a defendant in the Christic Institute with General John Singlaub, General Richard Secord, CIA Thomas Clines, and CIA Theodore Shackley, who Clines and Shackley went to work for the National Security Council after they absconded with millions of dollars from the Central Intelligence Agency. And one of the co-leaders of this group was Carlos Leder Rivas, who was arrested one day after this article was printed. Oche Vasquez has been named directly in charge of the 1983 Guns for Drugs transfer at Airfield Barranquilla, Colombia. The FBI was told this arrest involved a cargo plane with the markings of Southern Air Transport, the former CIA airline involved in Iran-Contra affair. Oche Vasquez and his 2 brothers were among 5 Colombians indicted in August of 1986. That is the updated Christic Institute suit, by a federal grand jury in Miami in the largest federal drug trafficking indictment in U.S. history. And also it's important because of their links to the National Security Council, to the Pentagon, and to the CIA. A senior law enforcement officer said that Marcos Cadavid, a Colombian extradited to the United States in 1985, worked with Ocha Vasquez in Miami. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and he's detailing the operations out of Colombia and into Miami. The wiretap to a lieutenant of Ocha Vasquez in Colombia went to the apartment of a Colombian embassy receptionist, Patricia Leon Gomez, where they picked up information about the Colombia network. Anthony Frank Nocero, 61, arrested on federal charges in Ozone Park, New York, is a member of the American La Cosa Nostra, who Centurio and Catone knew through their Sicilian Mafia connections. Now, last week, I went into some very important dates in chronological order of drug trafficking and persons dead or arrested or giving themselves up, or not necessarily drug trafficking, but related to George Bush and the drug traffickers, directly related to those people who were also in traffic. I'm going to repeat those for you and then insert the new dates of things happening in Miami that are pertinent to this case or elsewhere that are coming out, because this one trial of these 12 defendants is opening a wedge, another view of the operation and the operators who are linked to the White House and the National Security Council. And the other wedge is linked to the pizza connections of Donald Reagan, the Chief of Staff. Now, the news articles this week, the first, not for the past 2 weeks, the first one is the one I just cited, February the 3rd, that came in the Washington Post. The trial in Washington opened February the 2nd. The organized crime ties in Washington, Virginia, linked to Sicilian Mafia, to the Genovese crime family, to the cocaine of the Medellin network in Colombia, the drug cartel of Jorge Luis Ocha, the defendant in the Christic suit, to the pizza connections, both in Virginia and Washington, and to New York City, Southern Air Transport Contra drugs, using that airplane, bringing weapons down and returning with drugs. Now, last week I mentioned the murder of Donald Arano, George Bush's associate, who was about ready to deliver 13 boats. He manufactures one of the fastest boats for the Drug Enforcement Agency, and he also has the possibility of selling drugs to the smugglers for fast getaways. He couldn't deny that either. So the court case was February the 2nd. The article broke February the 3rd. On February the 4th, an associate of George Bush sold him a boat, has been identified with him in the Drug Enforcement Agency in Miami, and also identified as drug dealers, was gunned down in Miami. The very next day, February the 5th, Armando Fernandez Larias from DINA, from the Chilean Secret Service, asked for protective custody, would reveal his role in the murder of Orlando Letelier, working with Augusto Pinochet, the president of Chile. He wanted protection, and he surfaced. And, of course, the DINA worked with Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and Task Force 157 under Henry Kissinger and Robert Keith Gray, Nixon, Reagan Associates, the Public Relations Office. He wanted protection and gave himself up, and he's linked to these drug dealers and assassins. The very same day, Carlos Leder Rivas was brought to the United States, arrested on the 4th, brought to the United States where you don't have to hear him talk, bargain, blackmail. He's locked up. He's a partner of the persons named in the lawsuit in Washington. February the 6th, the newspapers had a column, the Associated Press and Wire Services, the LA Herald had, of the links of Rivas to Robert Vesco, which is another major artery. We could do 52 weeks on the Vesco connections to these people, and I'll update it, but the linkage of him came on national television, his association with Adolf Hitler, his association of ideas, Hitler's his hero, is Mussolini, and the connections of fascism and drugs is epitomized in the cocaine syndicate, working very closely with other cocaine and narcotic traffickers tied to the National Security Council, CIA, and Defense Department. February the 8th, 2 days later after the Rivas articles linking to Vesco were printed, because TV news isn't enough, and I have newsletters going back to 1983 and books linking Rivas to Robert Vesco. But 2 days later, a second suspect in the drug ring was arrested. His name is Jack Carlton Reed. His home base or port of operation is San Pedro, California, but he was picked up in Panama, and Panama is one of the major centers for offshore banking. For the Contragate banking, the Iranian funds went to Swiss banks and then to Panama. Panama has been a place for fascism and drug money, and he was arrested in Panama February the 7th, charged with a drug trafficking charge that goes back to 1981. This is 1987, and they had to bring him in, a partner of Leder Rivas, but he was arrested. This is the second fugitive in a cocaine case. I believe, like Klaus Barbie, was brought in 4 years ago and never went to trial. It is better to have them on the inside and silenced than on the outside, blackmailing for large sums of money. Now, February the 11th, 3 days later, Mr. Scott Pierce, the vice president, he used to be president, chairman of E.F. Hutton, decided to leave E.F. Hutton quickly. And an article in the Washington Post describes how he all of a sudden announced that he's leaving E.F. Hutton. Now, Mr. Pierce is the brother of Barbara Bush. He's the brother-in-law of Vice President Bush, and I last week was talking about the drug connections of George Bush, and I want to go into the role of Scott Pierce and E.F. Hutton and the news articles that are coming out, and some that I also have in my files that are interesting. So all of a sudden, Barbara Bush's brother resigns from E.F. Hutton, and I'll get into that in 1 second. This is Scott Pierce. But before I do that, 2 days after he resigned from E.F. Hutton, a man was killed in Miami in an alley. He said that he wanted directions to get his yacht repaired, but he has this multimillionaire, France Pastella, 64, has a home in Montreal, one in Nassau, where he rides his boats from Nassau to Miami, back and forth, and he was going to the 46th Annual International Boat Show. He spends his summers, as I say, in Montreal, and 1 week after the murder of Don Arno, the man who manufactures these very fast boats for the DEA or other people who want them, associated with George Bush, and Arno's associated with King Hussein of Jordan and Baby Doc from Duvalier from Haiti. Arno was gunned down, and 1 week after that, another boatman who works in the same milieu, the same places, out of Canada and out of Nassau, was gunned in an alley. They found some guys who did that, but of course they could just be paid to do it, and the courts would take care of them and let them out early. I think this man's background, the one who was gunned down in the alley, parallels a lot of the areas that we're talking about, an interest in common, and a lot more, I'm sure, is going to come out about this particular person. Just like that Mr. Perry that was killed in New York. Later, we find out he was linked to the Iranian arms, to narcotics traffic, and had an important job with General Motors and so forth, and was directly linked to some of these operations. But look for articles on Franz Pastella and his background. And February 13th, he was gunned down. And February the 14th, in New York City, Pietro Alfano was gunned. He survived. He isn't doing well. 3 men were arrested there. This is the one where they have the suspects. The other one, I don't believe they have any suspects on the murder of Franz Pastella. But Pietro Alfano, 46, is one of the defendants in that Pizza Connection trial. He was shot in Greenwich Village, New York City, and the Pizza Connections are directly linked to Merrill Lynch, E.F. Hutton, heroin cocaine funds, and this is a big trial that uses Tommaso Buscetta, the international Sicilian mafia. This is the Sicilian mafia pizza case that is just culminating in New York City, that's still going on in Italy, that links to the Washington, D.C., Virginia case. So what we have, since I updated you on the chronology last week, was Scott Pierce resigning and a second suspect being brought in of the cocaine gang that are involved both in the Washington case and in the Contragate story. Scott Pierce resigning, the Sicilian mafia gentleman being gunned down in New York City as part of the Pizza Connection, and the Sicilian New York mafia relating to the Washington, Virginia case, and the man in Miami, the boatsman who went to the 46th Annual International Boat Show, who was killed in an alley. Now, it was the Wall Street Journal, not the Washington Post, that had a story. Hutton's group, Scott Pierce, quit as vice chairman. Scott Pierce, vice chairman of E.F. Hutton, resigned unexpectedly. And this article in the Wall Street Journal doesn't tell you he's George Bush's brother-in-law. He decided to leave the securities firm because of a management reorganization. He felt that he had been replaced by Robert Reitzer, Rittereiser, Rittereiser, the chief executive officer who came from Merrill Lynch, that's Donald Reagan's office, to E.F. Hutton, as he became president in 1985, from Merrill Lynch and Company in the wake of Hutton's check-kiting scandal. In May of 85, Hutton pleads guilty, E.F. Hutton, to 2,000 counts of mail and wire fraud and bank overdrafting scheme. And the Hutton's chief executive last November, Robert Foreman, turned back a attempt by American Express to take over E.F. Hutton at the time. American Express is Kissinger Associates, member of Kissinger Associates, wanted to get, I guess, the E.F. Hutton records and books just at the time that they were involved with this huge financial scandal that also links to the crime syndicate. And Mr. Pierce just suddenly resigned this past week. Well, just in January, a month ago, January 22nd, 1987, there was a Washington Post article by Morton Mintz titled, E.F. Hutton paid Mr. Bell, this is Griffin Bell, the former Attorney General, $2.5 million fee to look into the books of the check-kiting probe because they're lawsuits blaming E.F. Hutton for hiding the top officials involved in these financial swindles and blaming persons down below. This is the second lawsuit that is going to give us a peek of Contragate as it keeps unfolding. Now, the former Attorney General, Griffin Bell, is on the board of E.F. Hutton. George Bush's brother-in-law was president of E.F. Hutton. And when Mr. Hassenfuss, Eugene Hassenfuss, took the Southern Air Transport, the very plane and airline involved with the cocaine case in Washington, D.C. now, and involved with the Contragate case filed by Christic Institute in May, when Hassenfuss landed in Nicaragua and was shot down, the very things he mentioned first are, one, George Bush, our vice president, and he mentioned Mr. Medina Cerelles, who was blew up Air Cuba when Bush was CIA director, and Mr. Gomez Rodriguez, who was active with our CIA from the Bay of Pigs on, and who worked with Klaus Barbie and the cocaine connections, and with George Bush, and with the Southeast Asian group. He was over there and killed Che Guevara for the Central Intelligence Agency. And Hasenfuss mentioned Bush, Gomez, Rodriguez, and Cirilles, all tied to the Bush connections. And the former Attorney General went right down immediately to help Hasenfuss get out. And then, of course, 60 Minutes sent a team down to say, you will be out by Christmas, and he was. Now, this article about E.F. Hutton reveals a lot about the organization, and George Bush's brother-in-law may have resigned this week, but this is while he was there. He was there 12 years. This article says E.F. Hutton paid $2.5 million to former Attorney General Griffin Bell, this is Hasenfuss's attorney who went down to get him out, for a special investigation of check kiting and financial manipulation that led the brokerage firm to plead guilty to 2,000 felonies and wire fraud. Bell's fee was disclosed in a deposition by a lawsuit that's taking place now, filed by John M. Pierce. One is P-E-A-R-C-E, who worked for Hutton. The other one is P-I-E-R-C-E, George Bush's brother-in-law. Pierce was former manager of E.F. Hutton's Bethesda office. A jury trial is scheduled to begin March 2nd, so watch for articles on this case, in which he alleges defamation and invasion of privacy. In the lawsuit, Pierce accused former Attorney General Griffin Bell of being an agent for E.F. Hutton. He accused him and the company of making Pierce a scapegoat for a scheme initiated, encouraged, administered by the senior corporate officers with the knowledge and active concurrence of their directors. Hutton and Bell, of course, have denied this. It will take place in court. Pierce's lawyers want to get the documentation of the role of the former Attorney General, Griffin Bell, the one that went down to rescue Mr. Hasenfuss. In court filings, lawyers for Pierce have put on the record portions of recent depositions in which Hutton chairman Robert M. Foman and President Scott Pierce, Barbara Bush's brother, said they were shocked at the extent of publicity around the guilty plea they took, but it turned out later that they had been blaming persons for activities to make them the fall guys and to flake away from the real problems in the case. Now, the Washington Post had an article January 27th, former Attorney General Griffin Bell, who investigated illegal cash management for E.F. Hutton, testified he didn't cite the offices of Hutton and Company in Washington simply because of an oversight. The people were not charged for crimes in the Washington E.F. Hutton that could link to these cases that I just mentioned that are also brewing in Washington, D.C. The branch accounted for 97, the Washington, D.C. branch of E.F. Hutton, accounted for 97 of 2,000 felonies of count and mail wire fraud, of which they pleaded guilty, and yet they weren't named, the offices in Washington, D.C. A former Bethesda branch manager said that this was an invasion of privacy and that they were making him the fall guy, as I say, for all these other people. Bell acknowledged that Hutton had obtained interest-free loans by overdrafts of its branches. They were overdrawing the national count. About November 1981, with a letter from the manufacturer's Hanover Trust, they complained that E.F. Hutton corporate headquarters had overdrawn their national account by $1 billion, vastly exceeding overdrafts in branches for many months. And Mr. Pierce's lawyers filed a complaint of 80 statements in which Griffin Bell's report were labeled as false assertions. They listed 23 assertions, September 5th, 1985, that were lies. They referred to the branches that overdrew more than $1 billion, and they were out of the Washington, D.C. branches, and the Pierce said the lawyers that pleaded guilty involved 113 branches, and the offices actually exonerated the law case 83 of these branches, including 55 representatives with 656 accounts and $1.2 billion. They failed to deal with anything but 10 offices, and they were actually representing 176 counts and $623 million. What I'm trying to say here from this article, and I think you understand it, is that only a few branches were touched in this case of investigation of E.F. Hutton, and the Washington, D.C. branch was not mentioned. Now, Jimmy Carter's Attorney General was Griffin Bell, and Jimmy Carter was going to be under investigation by the Justice Department and needed a special prosecutor for the investigation of Robert Vesco. And I have articles going back to 1981. The grand jury convened with newspaper reports that the Department of Political Justice should investigate Jimmy Carter's written direction to his Attorney General, that's Griffin Bell, to see representatives of Robert Vesco. And Vesco is a partner of Mr. Leder Rivas of the Colombia Cocaine Cartel. And they were supposed to meet with Vesco. Vesco would give a large amount of money to Jimmy Carter if he would erase the charges against him. And there were investigations and complaints that the Attorney General, this is Griffin Bell, was covering up the Vesco connections to Jimmy Carter. And now Jimmy Carter's attorney, Griffin Bell, the Attorney General, was down there with Hassenfuss, who was dealing with these cocaine dealers and gun runners, sending empty airplanes that would be empty back and putting the narcotics back, flooding them to the United States. I want to do more on Merrill Lynch next week. This is a little bit on the cocaine connections. Next week, I want to go into the pizza connections and the links of Donald Reagan to the Sicilian pizza connections, because the Congregate is fairly well going to cover the Colombia connections and their ties to E.F. Hutton and Griffin Bell and Hassenfuss. Next week, we'll go into Donald Reagan and the art of laundering drug dollars and the pizza connections of Merrill Lynch. The two merge, but I'll take them separately and be updating them. There are two different operations that come together in that lawsuit and that court case that's taking place in Washington, D.C. It's interesting. Eventually, these things do come together and have to come together, and outside law cases are bringing them up, not the Justice Department and nobody in the drug enforcement, but the private cases are smoking out these people who do connect together. So hopefully I will continue along these lines. There just isn't enough time. I could do hours, a whole year, an hour a day, and never even touch the drug connections of these people. But the time is up, so I have to accept that fact. I'll be back with you next week to continue Donald Reagan and the art of laundering drug dollars. This is Mae Brussell, and watch these court cases in the newspaper in Washington and the E.F. Hutton case, because they don't tell you all the things that connect, but maybe I'll have time to fill you in with some of them. In the meanwhile, take care. Thanks for the articles and books, and we'll continue on along these lines next week.